Everyone knows the name Stalingrad, the frozen river, the trapped army, the field marshal who would not break out because a man in Berlin had forbidden it. But on the same winter, in the same snow, 800 miles to the north, it happened again. A smaller city, a smaller garrison, 7,000 men, ordered to hold a town to the last, resupplied first by armored train, then by gliders crash landing in the streets, then by nothing at all. They called it the Little Stalingrad of the North, and almost no one remembers it. Velikiye Luki, a town of 30,000 people on the Lovett River, set between Leningrad to the north and Moscow to the east. Before the war, it was a quiet place, but a crucial one, because Velikiye Luki was a railway town. Here, the road and rail lines of the region all converged. Here, the wide rails of Western Europe narrowed to the gauge of Russia. Diplomats bound for Moscow changed trains in this town. The Soviets even kept a Western-style hotel for them, a little island of luxury in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place that looked unimportant on a map and turned out to be everything, because whoever held Velikiye Luki held the door between two halves of a continent and could slam it shut on an entire army. For the Germans, this town was a shield. Just beyond it ran the rail line feeding their entire northern front, the army strangling Leningrad. Los Velikiye Luki, and that siege might have to be lifted. For the Soviets, it was something more. Take this town, and for the first time since 1941, the Red Army would have a direct rail line to the back of the Great German Bulge at Rzhev, the salient that still pointed, like a dagger, toward Moscow. They had been trying to take it back since the summer of 1941, almost without pause. Attack after attack, winter after winter. The town had become an obsession, a single rusted hinge on which an entire front seemed to turn, a town of 30,000, and the fate of two army groups hanging on it. So the Germans dug in. Through 1942, they turned Velikiye Luki into a fortress, concrete bunkers, tank traps, each strong point given a German name: Bayreuth, Vienna, Nordlingen. At its heart stood an old citadel, a medieval fortress wrapped on three sides by the river, its earthen walls so thick that artillery barely scratched them. They stockpiled food and ammunition, sealed away, to be touched only if the city was ever cut off. They built a defense designed not to win, but to last, to bleed an attacker white, one fortified house at a time. Inside the town, about 7,000 men, a single reinforced regiment, under a garrison commandant named von Sass. Their orders, if the enemy ever closed the ring, were simple: hold each strong point to the death, then fall back to the next, make them pay for every street. It was a plan built on a single, unspoken assumption, that if the worst came, someone would come for them. In early November, hope arrived in the form of a man. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the conqueror of Sevastopol, moved his 11th Army into the gap. Surely, the soldiers thought, an offensive was coming. Why else would Germany's finest commander be here? Then, 800 miles to the south, the Soviets struck at Stalingrad, and everything changed. Manstein and his army were ripped away overnight and flung toward the catastrophe on the Volga. The men around Velikiye Luki were left exactly as they were, too few, holding too much, and now alone. On the 24th of November, 1942, the Red Army came. They did not batter the fortress head-on. They flowed around it, north and south, through forests the Germans had believed impassable, through snow that swallowed sound. By nightfall, the town was nearly surrounded. The outlying strongpoints were overrun so fast that the next morning Soviet infantry were already throwing themselves at the town itself. They were thrown back, bleeding, into the snow, and they came again the day after, and the day after that. For 7 weeks, the attacks would barely stop, company against bunker, brigade against rubble. The Soviet command spent men the way other armies spent ammunition, feeding whole divisions into the town until they burned out, then pulling them back to be rebuilt from scratch. 2 of their elite guards divisions were wrecked beyond use in the first week alone, and still it was not enough to crack the fortress open. On the 27th of November, the ring closed. the last telephone line into the garrison commandant's headquarters went dead. From that hour, the only thread connecting 7,000 men to the outside world was the radio. The next day, the Soviets cut the great rail line beyond the town, the very objective the whole battle was about. And in Berlin, a familiar order came down. No breakout. Hold at all costs. You will be supplied from the air, and you will be relieved. If this sounds familiar, it should, because at that exact moment, the same words were being spoken to a far larger army on the Volga. Hold, do not break out. The Luftwaffe will feed you. At Stalingrad, that promise would help kill 250,000 men. Here in the north, it was the very same script, only the cast was smaller. The High Command pointed to an earlier siege at Kulm, where a surrounded German force had held out and been saved. What worked once, they believed, would work again. But the air bridge to Velikiye Luki was a cruel joke. There was no airfield inside the perimeter. Parachuted supplies drifted down, and most of them fell straight into Soviet hands. So it came down to the glider pilots. They cut their engines and rode silent, fragile wooden aircraft down through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, placed there for the sole purpose of killing them, and crash-landed in the rubble of the streets. They brought in guns, ammunition, even men, and it was never, ever enough. More than 80 German aircraft were lost, trying to keep this one town breathing. Irreplaceable bombers and transports swatted out of the winter sky one by one. It was the Stalingrad airlift in miniature, with the same arithmetic and the same lie at its center, that an army could be fed through the air while it was slowly strangled on the ground. As December froze hard, the messages from inside the pocket grew darker. Losses very high, reserves short, ammunition strained, and the answer that came back over the radio was not food or shells or medicine. It was words. On the 16th of December, Hitler himself signaled the garrison, "I am convinced you will hold like iron, just as at Kulm, until you are relieved." The commandant, von Sass, replied with the line that would define them, "Velikiye Luki will be held until the last man." In the place of supplies, the High Command had sent slogans. Inside the town, the world shrank to cellars and rubble. Soviet shells smashed the masonry into clouds of concrete splinters, a second kind of shrapnel filling the air. The wounded piled up by the hundreds. The medical staff was so thinned that captured enemy soldiers were put to work tending them. There was almost no medicine. The food ran to scraps. What horse meat remained had gone bad. Disease moved through the cellars, and still the attacks came, day and night, company after company, brigade after brigade. The men measured their world in meters now. This cellar, that wall, the next pile of broken brick. Each strong point that fell was a step backward toward the river, toward the citadel, toward the place where there would be nowhere left to fall back to. On the last day of 1942, the garrison was cut in half. Contact was lost between the old citadel in the west and the rail station in the south. Two pockets now, where there had been one, each shrinking, and far to the southwest, the relief was finally coming. They called it Operation Totila. On the 4th of January, German spearheads lunged toward the town, fighting for every yard of frozen ground. They got close, agonizingly close, within 5 miles of the men who were waiting, listening, praying for the sound of their guns. Inside the pocket, they could almost believe it. 5 miles, a morning's walk on a summer road. But this was not summer, and there was no road, only frozen ground, open flanks, and a Red Army that closed in from the sides faster than the Germans could push forward. And there, 5 miles short, the relief stalled, its strength simply gone. 5 miles. It might as well have been 500. There was one last flare of hope. On the 9th of January, a German battle group fought its way into the citadel from the outside, a thin lifeline thrown to the trapped. If the citadel could be held and reinforced, perhaps the survivors could be gathered there and saved. Within hours, Soviet artillery destroyed every one of the 15 armored vehicles that had broken through. The lifeline was already a noose. The order was given to evacuate. The garrison was doomed. On the 15th of January, Von Sass began to send his final messages. At 20 minutes to 5 in the morning, a breakout appears out of the question. Almost 2,000 wounded would fall into enemy hands. Help must come from outside. Urgently request reply. At 20 past 7, we cannot break out. You must immediately break through to us. At 20 minutes to 9 came the last words anyone could make out. Urgently request artillery fire. And then, nothing. The radio went quiet. On the 16th of January, 1943, Velikiye Luki was declared lost. From the citadel, a desperate breakout had clawed westward through the snow. Of the entire garrison, around 150 men reached German lines. Of 7,000. 2 weeks later, 800 miles to the south, the last of the army at Stalingrad surrendered. The little Stalingrad of the north had simply gotten there first. By the standards of the Eastern Front, it had been a small battle. Around 150,000 casualties on both sides, beside the 2 million at Stalingrad, almost a footnote. But the men who fought it would not have called it small. The Soviet attackers had burned through entire divisions to take it. The German defenders had vanished into captivity and snow. And in one strange corner of the story, more than 1,000 soldiers of a Soviet Estonian division, sick of being spent like coins, had crossed over to fight on the other side. Later, captured, some of them ended up inside the German pocket itself, pressed into service tending the very wounded their old comrades were trying to kill. On this front, even the lines between enemies could blur. There were no clean sides here, only cold and hunger, and men doing whatever it took to live one more day. And here's the thing the maps don't show you. That little town did something Stalingrad's defenders never could. With Velikiye Luki gone, the Red Army finally had its rail line to the back of the Rzhev salient. The Dagger aimed at Moscow. Within weeks, the Germans abandoned Rzhev entirely. The threat to the capital was over, and the severed rail line in the north would never be repaired. The road that ran from this town led eventually into the heart of an entire German army group, the one that would be encircled and destroyed the following summer. Pull this one small thread, and the whole northern front begins to unravel. But the story of Velikiye Luki was not finished when the guns went quiet. It had an epilogue, 3 winters later. In January 1946, the Soviet authorities gathered a cross-section of the Germans who had fought here, from a general down to ordinary privates, out of the prison camps, and brought them back to the town, back to the very streets they had held to the last man. A military tribunal tried them, in public, for crimes tied to the war against the partisans. It was, in truth, a kind of show trial. Judgment passed as much on an army as on the men in the dock. 9 were sentenced to death. Among them, the 2 regimental commanders of the battle. And in the main square of Velikiye Luki, in the snow, before the watching town, they were publicly hanged in January 1946. The same square they had ordered held to the last man. The same snow, 3 years on. We remember Stalingrad because it was vast. We forget Velikiye Luki because it was small. But they were the same story, told twice in the same winter. A garrison ordered to die in place by men who would not come to save it, fed on slogans instead of bread. One became the most famous battle of the war. The other broke the German hold on the north, helped end the threat to Moscow, and set in motion the destruction of an entire army group, and then it slipped out of memory almost completely. History remembers the big numbers, the 2 million, the captured field marshal, the names that fit on a monument. It is far less kind to the small disasters, the 7,000, the railway town, the radio that simply went quiet one cold morning in January. 800 miles north of Stalingrad, in a railway town on a frozen river, 7,000 men were told to hold to the last. They did. And almost no one remembers their names.